On va attendre une petite minute que la salle se remplisse tranquillement. Merci à tous en tout cas de nous rejoindre
Thank you
aujourd'hui.
everyone for joining us today for this webinar, which is a presentation of the global synthesis for climate action, which was published in December following the COP27. We will present to you the great outcomes. There will be a word of introduction. Then Pierre Friedenstein will talk about the evolution of the emission for the year 2022. Technical points. This will be in French, but with live translation. Many of you have registered for this seminar. We chose to speak in French.
If you want to have the English translation, you can click on the globe button at the bottom of your screen. You can choose your preferred language right now. And feel free to ask any question, whether you speak English or French, in the chat box. And the slides will be translated in English. Merci également de faire attention, comme on est nombreux.
There are many of us on this call. Make sure you have your mics on mute so that we can listen clearly to one another. Without further ado, I'm now calling Renan, who is the president, to take the floor. Thank you, Antoine. Thank you for organizing this summit. Thank you for your work, for the work that has been done by the climate change teams. Just a few words, just to remind you that the Climate Change Association was funded or created 7 years ago, following the prior to the Paris Agreement, during the mobilization by field actors in order to reduce gas emissions and to adapt territories. So this was funded during that moment. It was a galaxy of all the various environmental associations. We are here to federate non-state actors in their diversity, local authorities, companies, NGOs, etc. First, to be able to exchange and share best practices to increase our common culture and knowledge, but also to meet and exchange, to also develop common projects, to work together, and to increase our common actions, and to also carry advocacy towards states and other bodies, such as the EU, in order to have a framework that would be more in favor of climate action. As part of this, we launched 5 years ago the Observatory, which is an observatory for non-state action, climate action. This observatory, I don't know about this translation in English, but it's a bit like the St. Thomas Observatory. We're not here to compile the engagements. There are other bodies to do that, to follow and monitor gas emissions, but we focus on the achievements, what has been done, how have the emissions levels evolved, and unfortunately still increasing in some cases. And I think this synthesis today, which is rather credible, and of course we are presenting this, this synthesis report is really useful to give structure to a debate. Everyone talks about climate issues. This is very much at the heart of the discussions in the media and everything. We hear a bit of everything as well at times, but our responsibility is to try to objectivize this debate to make sure that the actions will be connected to what we know as being efficient, and to also review the various frameworks for our actions and for the action that the states and governments are taking. And now we want to have some objectivity and to come out of the thread of climate fatalisms, meaning that people think we cannot reduce emissions. This report is without any compromise, and Antoine will highlight the difficulties. This synthesis report shows that there are ways, possibilities, and ways to quantify the emissions and to see how we can take actions to reach that goal. So I'm not going to go into the details. Antoine, you can have the floor again. And we want to thank all the speakers for this morning session. I think many of you are joined us, and it shows that this is a topic of interest and shows how much we need to have this objectivization to reinforce our action. Antoine, you have the floor. Thank you for everyone's efforts. You did a great job to release such a thorough and comprehensive report with such a small team. Thank you and well done. Thank you, Ronan, for your presence and your introduction. We want to objectivize the debate. That's the purpose of this report. So we want to start with gas emissions and the data for that, which is maybe the advantage and maybe the drawback of climate issues, to have universal metrics, be it for CO2 or equivalent CO2, to be able to read the evolution of our carbon impact on the planet in order to present the latest trends. I'm going to give the floor to Pierre Frenenstein. Pierre, you are a researcher at the Exeter University. You are also a researcher at the CNRS. And for some years now, you've been contributing to a very important project, which is well known now in the climate community, Global Carbon Budget. Every year, there is a compilation of the data in order to understand the evolution of gas emissions, especially CO2. Could you tell us a bit more and give us an overview of the trends over the last few years? Yes, indeed. Hello. Thank you again for this introduction, Antoine, and Renaud as well. Okay, as has been said in the introduction, the situation is really serious. Every ton of CO2 that is emitted is urgent to act. It's never too late. I'm going to share my screen now to show you the latest news of the global carbon budget. As you said, and this is the international, I'm one of the key player of these activities, and we are here to present together during conferences, during the COP meetings, mainly conferences, we are presenting the latest forecast for the coming year. So here I'm going to present to you what we presented in last November and last December. These are this is the state of data as we know them for CO2. We only focus on CO2. There are others taking care of methanes and others. Here we're talking about CO2, not CO2 equivalent. So what we are trying to quantify here are the anthropic perturbation of the global carbon cycle with fossil energy production and deforestation as well. And the carbon wells, be they in the oceans or on the ground. These are reactions due to the climate change. And so we have a report of all of these data. We share this with different researchers working on these issues. We put the pieces of puzzles together and we check and verify if we manage to understand the evolution of CO2. This is a picture that shows an overview, a mapping for the last decade. In 2010, from 2010 to 2020, with the various reserves. I'm going to go into details for each of these components or arrows. Here, and the most important one is this global fossil CO2 emissions. Here you see the evolution of CO2, fossil CO2 since 1960s on an annual, on a yearly basis, with a continuous growth due to the combustion of fossil energy, coal, and we went from about 35.5 gigatons of CO2, about 3 times more over 60 years. you can see that for some year, the growth was slightly decreased in the 70s, 80s. The financial crisis also in 2008, with a slight decline of gas emissions, of CO2 emissions rather. And again, a last event in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, which reduced, of course, greatly the CO2 emissions. People stayed home. There was a decreased emission, but very little really, and overall about 5% decrease only. And in 2021, it went up again in all the countries, including France. We started issuing and producing emissions, CO2 emissions. Now in 2022, the production or projection for 22 in November, we did not have the final figures for the end of the year, but the prospect for 22, projection for 22 is that we are back to the same level that we had reached in 2019. So no real decrease overall. We are vaguely optimistic to say that in the year 2000, we've seen an increase of about 3%, about 1% on average over the last 10 years, but the overall production or emissions of CO2 is not going down. We haven't reached the peaks. Now, if we look at the country, if we look at country level and the main countries, do you see the green line here in the middle of my screen? Yes, we see it. There's a kind of a green snake. I don't know where it's come from. It's not me, actually. I don't know. Okay, this is not a country, by the way. In any case, here, what we see are the main countries which are emitting CO2, fossil CO2s. For many years, we had the States and Europe, which were at the forehead, at the top, but with the growth of China now, China is a main emitter of CO2, about 30% growth, or 30% of global emissions, followed by the US, 14%, and EU, the EU 27, about 8%, close to India in terms of global emissions, representing about 8% overall. So here you see a decrease. If we look at France, we are just here at the bottom. We are also growing, but overall, mainly China and India and the US emissions continue to grow. Another important element here is the deforestation, the land use change. Now, emissions are not measured as well. We are not able to measure. We are measuring the land use change, forests becoming meadows or fields. And this is what the FAO is listing. So from those land use changes, we are able to see how many carbon wells are involved in this transformation. If we go from a forest to a meadow, how much carbon will be released in the atmosphere. So from there on, we are trying to quantify the various models. So what is for sure, this is what you see to the left in brown. It is a large figure. We have an estimate for 4 billion tons per year. And it is very complicated because the difference between two flux, one flux for deforestation when we deforest tropical forests, which produces CO2 emissions. And on the other hand, we are reforesting. We are leaving in some regions agricultural lands because we need less surface areas. For example, in the US or even in China now, for the last 10 years, we are reforesting, and that is absorbing CO2. So the flux is the difference between emissions and the wells. Overall, if we look at the main countries involved, what we see here, and we talk a lot, of course, about Brazil, and it's not the only country. Indonesia as well is on the list. with a lot of deforestation, and also in Africa, in the Republic of the Congo, which is in third country in terms of CO2 emissions at the global level for land use change and deforestation. But if we put all of this together, keep in mind that fossil emissions is about 35, 40 gigatons. So we have a lot of the emissions due to combustion. So we have about 40 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every year. And in 22, a comparable level to what we had before the pandemic in 2019. So if you look at this graph here, you can see we can say that we can be slightly optimistic. So for the last 10 years, they have not really increased that much, but still they are very high and far from being on the decline. What is necessary to limit the impact, and I will come back to this. If we look at the immediate impact, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Mauna Loa is the oldest in the Hawaii, the Hawaii island in Pacific, with a gradual concentration of the CO2 in the atmosphere. You see the long term, and in the color, this is black, and in the color, the various variations with some more feeble or weaker data in the summer and higher in the winter because of the activities. In the summer, the CO2 is absorbed, and in the winter season, it is released. So we went from about 320 per to over 420 ppm, representing about 50% more than what we had before the 19th century, for example, before we started injecting CO2 in the atmosphere. So we have increased it by about 50%. The actual level is a level we had not observed for many, many years. Of course, the impact on the environment and on climate change. And what we also quantify and measure here is a remaining carbon budget, which is what remains, which has to be at the maximum if we want to be reaching our goals, be it for the Paris Agreement to reach the 1.5 or even 2%, or 2 degrees rather. So there needs to be a quantity of CO2. Part of it will be absorbed by the oceans. Part will contribute to global warming. So we can calculate how much CO2 will be emitted before we reach those degrees. These are probabilities. There's one chance out of 2. There are other probabilities with 1 out of 3, 1 out of 10. So we have a probabilistic approach to make those measurements. So what we are finding is that if we want to reduce the global warming to 1.5, since the beginning of the 1850s, we already have emitted 2,500 million tons. So we have about 380,000 tons, which we can still emit between now and the end point. We are emitting about 50 billion tons per year, 380 quickly, 300 divided by 40. So if we continue to have the same level of CO2 emission without doing anything, without reduction, without mitigation, in 9 years, that gives us a 9 years delay. In 9 years, we will reach those figures. If we have a bit more margin, if we accept 2 degrees, so we can make the same calculations, 1,230 billion tons divided by 40, so about 30 years. So by 30 years, if we don't do anything in 30 years, we will reach those levels. So whatever is our climatic objective, there is a carbon assessment, meaning that we need to drastically reduce the CO2 emissions are. Here we have about reached the 40 billion tons, and we need to reach 0 by 2040 or by 2080 if we are aiming at 2 degrees, depending on the scenarios. And if you add some degrees, it gives you a bit of margin, gives you a few more years. But no matter what happens, whatever the goal, we have to reduce emissions in the coming decades. Just one last slide to acknowledge those who have worked on this project. This is a result of a common work involving hundreds of people in the world. Just to thank here all the sponsors, the EU, universities, all those who have helped us to do this work. Everything as presented here is available. This is published. You can see the link. I guess Antoine will forward the necessary information, but all the slides are in open access on our Global Carbon Budget, Global Carbon Project website. Thank you. Thank you, Pierre. Indeed, we will forward the data and the information at the end of this webinar. First question, maybe before we move on, Darmel from Armel asking, what is the annual reduction level to reach 1.5 degrees? Another question, does this include retroaction, meaning permafrost? How do you take this into account in this kind of a scenario? If you can say this in 2 minutes. Okay, quickly indeed. The average reduction rate is about 5–7% per year. If we want to keep our focus, the more ambitious we are, the more the reduction rate is with what we had in 2020. So we will need to have something like COVID every year. So we need to have a reduction like we experienced during the COVID pandemic every year to reach our goal. Now, for feedback loops, yes, we calculate the various systems that take into account the carbon wells in the oceans and in the biosphere. This is taken into account. Some are not yet fully integrated, like the permafrost. It's still under development, not completely fully integrated. In order to make this kind of prospects and estimates, they do not take into account the permafrost. There are some independent forecasts which give different figures. In those figures, it is taken into account, but traditionally it is not quite the same. It's a different type of calculation to try to involve the feedback loops. Thank you for your presentation, which was very specific and really gave an objectivization of our scope for the future to show what we have, what leeway we have for the future in order to maintain the global warming at a threshold that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. What we'll do now with the global synthesis report for climate action is to try to objectivize what we have done over the last few years to show and present the various climate actions that have been implemented by non-state actors. I'm going to share my screen now. I think we are ready to go. Okay, I'm introducing myself again. Antoine Gilles, I'm the director of the Global Observatory for Climate Action at Climate Change, with my colleague Tanya Marta Thomas. She's a research officer. We will now present the results, the main findings of the main key takeaways. Just quickly to remind you that climate change is not just an observatory. We are also organizing events every year, and that we also facilitate a number of webinars. It's also a portal for climate action to consult all the information that you can find useful for local actions, local initiatives, whatever has been implemented by the various research centers and other actors working on this topic, and to follow the climate agenda. The observatory had three main assignments. First, to analyze the evolution of emissions data in all their complexity. We've seen this. There is a trend to increase the gas emissions in the atmosphere. So our assignment, our mission at Climate Change is to really look at the complexity of these trends. And then we want to narrate the story of the action behind figures. How do we explain the positive or negative variations of gas emissions through public policies, business strategies, and civil society initiatives which are implemented? And our last assignment or mission is to share the signals of transitions and the best practices which have been identified in all those studies. So how do we go about this? The Global Observatory for Climate Action has an editorial committee. There is a team at Climate Change coordinating various publications. We do not have all the expertise to tackle all the topics, so we also have a network of expertise that we work with, journalists, consultants, practitioners who come also to feed our reports, who come and share case studies. And we also have experts, and we have then a series of publications which we publish throughout the year through various sector-based reports, local actions, finance, adaptation reports, and case studies in order to look into details at various actions. The Global Synthesis Report, which is being presented today on climate action by sector, which is the global synthesis. This is a publication which we launched last year. This is the 5th edition. This is a synthesis of the literature. Our methodology is not to produce, but actually to come up with a synthesis to make it available in order to tell the story behind the figures on the way that actors and stakeholders are working on the evolution of gas emissions in the previous year. So we want to show the complexity of climate action through economic, the geopolitical, and all the various environments and influences which can play a role on those stakeholders. And then we publish all these findings, and we show the complexity of this work. Tanya, can you tell us about more in details how to approach this publication, which was released in November? Yes, indeed, this 5th edition of the synthesis report, which has just been presented, is divided into 5 different sectors: energy, transport, building, waste, land use. And this time we also have a special on carbon offsets. We have a special feature for carbon offsets. So this report is really made for you to read by sector. You can look for topics, you can look by sector, you can look for specific information, and also you can have an overview, a global overview, to have a broader view. We have 3 main sectors in this 5 sectors, rather. We have figures, we have indicators for gas emissions and the evolution of actions for each. We have a beautiful infography on a double page, and we have the trends which we present. This is really the heart of this report. These are analysis of 6 to 7 or 10 pages, which explain what are the main trends. Then we have signals, which are press reviews, which identify the various changes of policies or market changes, which are not yet current trends, but which will be current trends for the future. We also have case studies, which is a more practical analysis when we analyze various initiatives or projects which were really implemented on the ground, which could be duplicated as well, and which could be a source of inspiration for other decision makers. Thank you, Tanya. As I was saying, this synthesis report is a collaborative project which required a lot of expertise and contributions. You see here all the various organizations that have contributed to the report last year. We will renew this experience again this year and every year. you can see all of these contributors. It gives you an idea of the collaborative work that has been done. And of course, I want to commend here the Observatory team. And finally, we have partners who support us, public partners, private partners, who support the Observatory in its approach. They come to bring their own expertise, their technical support, and they support all the events which we organize in order to help us publish all the key takeaways. Now, without further ado, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the key takeaways of this report. As we started, we tried to start with data of gas emissions. We're not going to repeat what Pierre just said, but what we show here are some geographic trends, especially with the past year. Pierre said it. There was a strong decline during the COVID pandemic in 2020, rather weak still, but weaker than before. We can see that gas emissions have speed up again, and that's what we want to show in terms of geographic complexity. There are some various trends depending on regions and countries. Within the OECD, we are seeing an increase of the emissions, but below the level of 2019. So there is a trend for a decline, but for Russia, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, there is an increase, which is in line with the development strategies which are following. So, and we are already above the level. So Tanya, Pierre said that most of the emissions are fossil emissions. What are the trends throughout the last year after the recovery post-COVID? Yes, indeed, if we look at what is behind the figures, with the rebound and the recovery after the pandemic, it has increased by 5.8% in primary energy demand, with the fossil fuels representing 82% of the primary energy use to make up for this demand. So if we look more into details, here with the fossils, we see that it was coal mainly that absorbed part of the shock in 2020 during the pandemic, but then that experienced the greatest rebound or recovery in 2021. So 40% actually of the increase for gas emission globally. If we look at the gas, there was an increase of demand throughout all sectors, despite the cost increase that we experienced. And with the recovery, which started in the Asian countries at the spring or summer of 2021, there was a focus mainly on gas, natural liquefied gas, and this was even more so intensified, first of all, with a much colder winter in Europe and with the geopolitical crisis, which triggered all the price increase. Now, if we look at oil, it's the only fossil for which demand has remained below the pre-pandemic level, and with the quota and the production costs by the OPEC countries. And some analysts show or question the capacity of oil production of these countries. Despite all this, we see that renewable energies have not stopped their growth, tremendous growth, which started already some years ago. And these renewables represented 81% of all capacity additions in 2021. Here you can see the curves here on the graph. In dark green, you have the capacity additions, and in light green, you have the renewable capacity additions. And you see the yellow curve representing the relative part of the renewable additions. There is a trend really between the two curves that shows how the renewable capacity additions are growing. But if we look at the mix energy, the share of energy in electricity production, it doesn't really change so much, hasn't changed so much over the last 2-3 years. We are seeing a mix that is rather carbonized, with 62% of fossil energy and 38% of clean energy, nuclear and renewables. So here it's important to keep in mind the various factors, which is the current production of electricity by a central or a plant compared to the maximal capacity for nuclear plants. It's 70%, whereas for fossil, it's between 40 to 50%, and for renewables, it's even less than 30% for the wind energy, and between 10 to 25% for solar energy. So that again depends on the geographical location of those plants. So overall, it takes 4 watts of solar production or 2 watts of wind energy in order to have a similar capacity with 1 watt of fossil energy. If we just summarize the various trends by geography, what we see here is that gas is really at the crossfire. It's with a stagnation in the US, with a peak in places like Japan, and for a long time now. Within the EU, we are not seeing any clear transition in place. We are above the lowest threshold, which we had in 2015. We are also way below the peak, which was reached in 2012. So the war in Ukraine is changing the game when it comes to the transition with gas within the EU. Now, when we look at coal, we see a decline, an undeniable decline of coal. Many economies which were based on coal, the peak was already reached in Australia, UK, and Japan. There was a rebound in the US and in Europe, but not to challenge this new trend for lack of competitiveness of coal. If coal continues to grow today globally, it's because of its dependency to public subsidies, especially in India and China. Without this public support, be it to build plants in the country or outside, the coal energy is really going down and is less competitive when it comes to renewable or even gas, to make a comparison. Now for renewables, we are seeing an increase pretty much everywhere, Japan, US, Europe, with some massive investment plans to support the Inflation Reduction Act or the European Green Deal in Europe, and also some various market mechanisms to support the expansion of renewable energy in industrialized countries and developing countries, power purchase agreement for direct purchase of electricity, which have become more and more successful in Africa mainly. Now let's look at the various obstacles with relation to the trends that we have observed in 21-22. We are just about getting the 2022 data and figures, so we will have to update this later on. But the trend here is an inflation in energy prices. This is a trend that we have observed, especially for fossil energy. Coal prices have been multiplied by 3, gas by 6. Prices of oil also very much increased, despite some fluctuations during the pandemic. There is a trend for decline. Since the second semester of 22, there was a double shock for request and demand and offer generated by climate conditions, meaning that it started before the war in Ukraine by some drought as well in China, in India, also in Brazil, which reduced the production capacities, which generated an over demand for more flexible production, such as gas, which led to an increase of demand for natural gas, which led to a pressure at a time when we were just coming out of the lockdown. So there was a disbalance and competition games for oil. and coal. It is the same logic in India and China. We relaunched the production of carbon of coal to make up for the lack of capacity of electricity. And then another geopolitical factor, the war in Ukraine, came along and led to a decline of the production of Russian exportation at the EU level, and with an increase of the demand for other energy from other countries. So we are in a kind of a mixture of causes and reasons which are geopolitical and structural, and also structural climate trends as well, which continue to put pressure on these energy resources. Same with the metals, or what we call the metal, which are strategic to the transitions. Here you have a price index for four types of metals, which are indispensable: lithium, cobalt, and nickel, which are used for making electric batteries. We see here that the price index have skyrocketed since the end of 2020 and throughout 2021-22 because of an increase of the demand for those metals, but also a disbalance between the distribution and the production capacity and refinery. There is international competitiveness for these metals. There is an impact which we've seen for the first time in the last 15-20 years. We've seen an increase of the photovoltaic cells and the wind turbines when the prices had been divided by 10 in the last few years. So we're seeing this impact, which is connected to a speeding up of energy sovereignty and the pursuit of the transition, which could be confirmed in the future if there's a lack of relocation. This is exactly what we have here. If we look at the main industrialized countries and developing countries, which have a lot of raw materials, we have seen, for example, a production of lithium-ion batteries, which led to many new production plants, gigafactories, as we call them, due to the dependency of EU for China or Asian supply. Most of our supplies or batteries are produced in China, and Chinese producers, manufacturers dominate the market. Japanese and Korean come on top of that. So be it for Europe or for the US, there is a strong dependency to the Asian continent for lithium-ion batteries and for electrification products. So many projects have been implemented in Europe, many new investments in the US, in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is an important act to recover a form of industrial sovereignty and climate sovereignty while investing in these sectors. Other countries, developing countries like Indonesia, Bolivia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are also implementing policies in order to highlight their natural energy and resources to produce and refine those metals and to produce batteries with their own industrial capacities. And finally, one last thing that could be an obstacle, and that is a concentration of the key transition sectors of the value chain. We've seen a record number of acquisitions in the energy sector in 21 to the benefit, or meaning that the big ones are eating the smaller ones. The smaller producers like energy communities, municipal communities, which are very popular in Germany, for example, had to cease their activities or were bought back by larger stakeholders in order to resist to an increase of prices in other sectors like maritime transport. Very interesting to see that this was not very profitable in the last few years, yet they were able to generate record benefits in 21 and 22 with a capacity of investment, which means that a number of stakeholders were able to also invest on land investments. A company, ECM or Maers, can also become new stakeholders upstream and downstream the supply chain and become a main player for decarbonation. Last part of our presentation now, which are the key takeaways, sectoral transition trends. Tanya, you have the floor. Okay, so in the building sector, this is where we are seeing the convergence, the most concrete convergence of the various stakes. We have figures here to your left. You see the emissions for buildings, for the building sector, 37% from the building sector, but now most of those emissions came from energy emissions and indirect emissions due to electricity usage and air conditioning, of course, etc., but also devices, electronic devices, and others. So here we see the heating of buildings, especially in the northern countries, is rather still carbonated with electricity, and it is not specified here whether it is renewable or not. So electricity plays a small part here. It is not specified, though. There is an emergency to decarbonize the heating in the buildings. There are often local governments which are taking initiatives in order to change this, like Vienna in Austria. They implemented a new policy to come out of the dependency of Russian gas. At the same time, what we are seeing here is a growth, an increase of demand for cooling or for air conditioning of buildings, which is a much stronger challenge in the developing countries. This is also something that is encouraging the demand, the request for electricity. For example, in India, in the summer of 22, the request for AC air conditioning exceeded the capacity of production of electricity by 2%, meaning that the country had to open up 2 coal plants in an emergency. We need to keep in mind the fact that it is also a challenge for survival for many people who may be at risk because of a lack of access to cooling. There is an emergency for action, especially for insulation, for buildings, depending on where we are. On the next slide here, we can see the cost savings that have been possible through improvement of the ventilation and the insulation of the buildings. This is a very important and more relevant stake in Europe or in the northern hemisphere, where most of those buildings already exist. In Europe in 2019, the renovation rate was about 1%, which is not enough if you take into account all the challenges. But on the other hand, in other countries, in emerging countries, buildings are being built now, and therefore the climate stakes are now included in the design phase of those new buildings, especially ventilation and the whole architecture of those buildings, and even choosing the right materials. So this is already included in these new buildings, like the TIFA, for example, which is used as an insulation. If you look at various tools that have been implemented to decarbonate buildings, especially for heating, we see that urban networks, heat networks rather, are more and more expanded. The district heat networks, IEA, still we have to pay attention to what is the source of energy or heating. For example, these networks are very much present in Russia or in China, but they are using fossil energy most of the time. Another solution, another lead that we are seeing are heat pumps. Heat pumps at the moment are meeting 10% of the needs of heating, But what we are seeing in that this is a rate that is increasing quickly. Between 21 and 2020 and 21, heat pumps have increased by 13% at a global level and 35% in Europe, which is huge within just the scope of 1 year. Antoine, you have the floor. You need to unmute. When it comes to transport, and we'll just have 5 minutes, there is a trend to electrification. This is the first vehicle of the transition. We have if we can look at the shift of transportation means, but electrification is engaged in all of the industry with an increase of EV vehicles. 1 out of 10 in the world now is an electric car. 9 out of 10 are still ICE vehicles, with rates going up to 2 out of 10 in Europe and China. So one of the main factors for electrification is the public investments. Here to the right, you can see with the green bars, there's a slight increase of public investment from 1 year to the next, with an explosion of private investment in parallels, meaning that there's a lever effect for public investments. Part of the public investments tend to go down year by year, meaning that there is a capacity to engage the industry, like for charging stations, when we develop sufficient devices to switch to electric vehicles. These vehicles respect the thresholds of emissions that have been given by the EU standards in order to reach the level, and the electrification, especially for two-wheelers. In India, for example, we've seen the tuk-tuk, the electric tuk-tuk in Sudan as well, under development. We are seeing buses also in South America and in China. Bicycles in Europe, we have more electric bicycles and mechanic bicycles here in Europe now, which is a strong symbol. Mobility is also another trend that we are seeing to massification. We're seeing 45% in the world are SUVs in global sales, 45%, and more than half of the electric vehicles are SUVs. So there is an electrification of the SUV market. Why is this a problem? Because SUVs are much heavier vehicles. They consume more, they take more room, more space, and they don't really encourage sobriety in such a context. And the weight, of course, and the size of the battery also account for much. Mobility is not just about proximity. We also talk about long distances here. There is a trend to see also electrification. With the pandemic, we saw a number of companies, train companies, which stopped their activities, and therefore they were able to electrify their activities. So now they are also looking at liquefied gas and ammoniac, which is and methane as well, which are new technologies which are not yet up to it. To the right, you can see that you have to keep the source of production. Less than 2% of hydrogen produced in the world comes from low carbon energy, which is a very low figure. Much efforts have to be made still to shift to an energy mix. And finally, for air traffic, the main factor, which is a CORSIA system or scheme, will help to engage this offsetting system as we wait for the new systems such as hydrogen or the electrification of aircrafts, which have been much on demand, but not very much supported yet. One last sector that we wanted to focus on, and that is forests. Tanya, briefly, you can present the last trends, and Pierre has explained that already. Very quickly, we lost 3.5 millions of hectares of forest, about 11 millions of tropical forest. When we look at the global figures, we need to take into account the trends per country. If we look at the countries with largest tropical forests in Indonesia and in Brazil, in the Congo, it's increasing. The net effect is declining. You have figures here. Also, there are commitments of the private sector. We have 58% of the companies and financial companies which are involved in the supply chain that are causing risks in the forest, which have committed to reforestation. We are seeing here some subsectors. For example, if you are seeing the sector for which we had a beautiful progress in 21, companies have committed to 61%, 71% actually, and in such sectors like leather and others, companies are not as committed. So we see also the popularity of the financing that are releasing co-benefits for biodiversity. And there again, we are seeing a new trend that is similar to the forest. We have strategic sites for biodiversity, which are more and more taken into account in protected areas, but also indicators show that the goals or targets have not been reached. So there are new commitments that have been made during the COP15 in December, and this will be important to monitor. Thank you. There is a special focus
c'est celui donc, des crédits dits de compensation. En gros, un porteur de projet a envie de faire financer son projet qui va bénéficier à une réduction, une absorption ou un évitement d'émissions de CO2. Il peut faire certifier son projet et mettre sur le marché des crédits qui vont confirmer que ce projet permet donc des baisses d'émissions. À l'autre bout de la chaîne, une entreprise qui fait des efforts de réduction de ses émissions de gaz à effet de serre va chercher à compenser ces émissions résiduelles en allant mettre à son actif des émissions qu'elle aura permis de financer en achetant donc ces fameux crédits sur le marché. C'est aujourd'hui un marché qui est extrêmement contesté. On l'a vu durant le mois de janvier avec une enquête du Guardian qui met en cause les méthodologies de mesure des émissions évitées par les projets de conservation. C'est un marché aussi également qui a un prix de la tonne CO2 qui est relativement faible encore à l'heure actuelle par rapport au prix qui est estimé avoir un impact réel sur les tendances d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. En tout cas, ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est qu'il y a un vrai intérêt, notamment pour les solutions fondées sur la nature à travers ce marché, essentiellement par des projets de conservation des forêts, pas tellement par des projets de plantation, comme on peut se l'imaginer. C'est un marché qu'on va essayer de suivre d'année en année parce que c'est un canal de financement et d'orientation des financements privés vers des projets potentiellement bénéfiques au climat et à la biodive. Ce sera le mot de la fin. Climate Change œuvre à cette convergence des agendas du climat, de la biodiversité et de la désertification. On voit aujourd'hui qu'il y a une tendance sur ces secteurs-là à essayer de mobiliser justement et d'investir dans des projets qui ont aussi des co-bénéfices pour la biodive. Donc nous, on va essayer d'année en année de suivre ça et d'avoir ce même regard objectivant qui nous permet d'analyser les évolutions du marché. On vous remercie pour votre attention. On a déjà dépassé un petit peu le temps qui nous était imparti. La traduction va donc se terminer. Par contre, si vous voulez poser des questions, on peut rester encore 5 minutes ensemble. Simplement vous dire qu'au mois de mars, le 23, il y a un webinaire organisé par l'Observatoire de l'action climat en Afrique et toute l'équipe des coalitions Climate Change sur l'agroécologie, les systèmes alimentaires et les forêts. Début avril, nous publions un rapport sur l'impact environnemental de l'industrie de la mode et du textile français en partenariat avec Paris Good Fashion. Et puis cette année, le bilan mondial de l'action climat sera orienté vers le Global Stock Take, cette première grande évaluation des progrès collectifs des États lors de la COP28. Nous y reviendrons et nous écrirons là-dessus très prochainement. Merci à tous. Au revoir à ceux qui doivent nous quitter et on reste quelques minutes pour ceux qui veulent nous poser des questions. Et je pense qu'il y a quelques questions qui ont été mises de côté. J'en ai vu certaines passer, notamment sur la pénétration des énergies renouvelables en Allemagne. Effectivement, l'Allemagne aujourd'hui fait partie de ces quelques pays qui sont parvenus à atteindre un taux assez important de production de son électricité par énergie renouvelable. Rappelons aussi que l'électricité, ce n'est que un quart de l'énergie que nous consommons dans le monde. Donc, quand on regarde le mix électrique, on ne regarde qu'une toute petite partie de nos consommations énergétiques. Et donc, c'est important d'avoir une perspective plus large, notamment sur l'électrification des bâtiments ou du transport, qui sont des secteurs dans lesquels on consomme encore beaucoup d'énergie fossile. Armel, tu avais une question?
Sur les ressources rares, les métaux, le lithium, j'avais entendu que le cuivre était également en tension, même si le cuivre est recyclable, mais on a une telle consommation de cuivre qu'on risque dans 10 ans de ne plus en avoir du tout disponible. Vous avez des infos?
Oui, absolument. Le cuivre est une des ressources, alors pas seulement pour la transition bas carbone, mais c'est vrai que c'est un des métaux sur lequel il y a beaucoup de tensions. C'est l'IFP Énergie Nouvelle qui fait des super études là-dessus, métaux par métaux, ce qu'on appelle la criticité des métaux. Un métaux qui est considéré comme critique, c'est un métal qui est à la fois, pardon, un métal, c'est un métal qui est à la fois soumis à des pressions géopolitiques parce qu'il y a une raréfaction de la ressource. Par exemple, c'est le cas du lithium qui est concentré sur un tout petit nombre de pays. Il y a une rareté géologique, ça veut dire qu'on n'en a potentiellement pas beaucoup dans la croûte terrestre. Il peut y avoir également une rareté plus politique, hein. Par exemple, quand l'Indonésie décide d'arrêter ses exportations de nickel pour développer sa propre industrie de véhicules et de batteries électriques, on se retrouve dans des situations de raréfaction pour les marchés. Donc IFP Énergie Nouvelle a énormément de ressources à ce sujet. Russell.
Ok, merci. On a remarqué dans la présentation du professeur Pierre Friedrichstein que le taux d'émission de CO2 est plutôt constant depuis une décennie. Ce que je voudrais savoir, c'est est-ce que cela est significatif au regard des objectifs climatiques ou alors, voilà, c'est...
Le taux d'émission de CO2 est en augmentation quasi constante dans son rythme annuel. Ça veut dire que chaque année, on émet plus dans l'atmosphère que l'année précédente. Et ça, c'est une première chose. Et effectivement, il y a quelques événements dans l'histoire qui ont généré une baisse des émissions, mais très ponctuelle. Donc aujourd'hui, cette trajectoire croissante des émissions diminue de fait ou accélère notre rythme de consommation du budget carbone qu'il reste. Pierre avait dit, il y a 380 gigatonnes qu'on peut encore émettre si on veut rester sous 1,5 degré. Si on continue à augmenter la quantité qu'on émet chaque année, on accélère l'épuisement de ce budget carbone. C'est comme si on élargissait le siphon de la baignoire qui absorbe l'eau qu'il y a à l'intérieur. Ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, on n'est pas du tout dans les proportions, dans les trajectoires mondiales de décarbonation qui nous permettent de rester sous les seuils de 1,5 degré. À noter également que dans certaines régions du monde, on a déjà dépassé les 1,5 degrés. C'est le cas, par exemple, de la France et globalement de toute l'Europe de l'Ouest. On est déjà au-dessus dans les mesures de température régulièrement rapportées, au-dessus de 1,5 degré par rapport à l'époque pré-industrielle. Donc, il y a aussi des équilibres géographiques en termes d'impact qui sont générés.
Ok, s'il vous plaît, pour terminer, au regard de ces dynamiques-là,
Ouais.
et lorsqu'on voit aujourd'hui la volonté qu'ont les pays qui sont en voie de développement d'atteindre un niveau de développement voilà, en passant par le même chemin d'industrialisation que les autres, est-ce que c'est prometteur aujourd'hui? Ou bien quelles sont les actions concrètes qui sont mises en place pour réduire ou bien atteindre cette neutralité carbone souhaitée?
C'est une vraie question d'égalité face à la transition, ce qu'on appelle en fait l'enjeu de la transition juste. On l'a dit dans le chat, par exemple, le continent africain ne représente que 4% des émissions mondiales. Il y a donc une attente légitime en termes de développement économique qui peut générer sa quantité de gaz à effet de serre. L'idée, c'est de trouver des trajectoires de développement qui soient compatibles avec un monde vivable en dessous de 2 degrés. C'est d'abord la responsabilité des pays historiquement émetteurs, mais aussi futurs. C'est toute la tension qu'on peut observer dans les négociations au sein de la COP. Par exemple, un pays comme la Chine, aujourd'hui, est le premier émetteur mondial, y compris rapporté en termes d'habitants. On est sur des taux assez proches de l'Union européenne. Il y a donc peut-être une responsabilité future de ces grands émergents en termes d'émissions. Et puis, pour des trajectoires de développement, il faut trouver des activités, des ressources qu'on peut valoriser, qui rapportent des bénéfices aux communautés locales, tout en protégeant la nature. C'est le cas, par exemple, de l'exploitation des forêts, qui peuvent être valorisées pour leur puits de carbone, en bonne intelligence avec des activités agricoles et agroalimentaires, par exemple. On a eu ces discussions-là lors du One Forest Summit au Gabon la semaine dernière. Anne-Charlotte.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup.
Bon.
Vous avez parlé un peu, merci beaucoup d'abord pour cette présentation qui était vraiment très intéressante. Vous avez parlé un peu des marchés carbone à la fin, mais pas très longtemps, malheureusement.
Oui.
Je sais que vous n'avez pas eu le temps. Je voulais vous poser, en fait, je voulais savoir ce que vous pensiez de la proposition récente de la Commission sur un cadre volontaire de certification des absorptions de carbone, et plus largement, ce que vous pensiez de toutes ces activités et de toute cette technologie de captage, de stockage de carbone.
Bien noté. Josué, peut-être dernière question, et comme ça, on répond aux deux en même temps.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour m'autoriser la parole, me donner la parole. Je suis M. Josué Aruna, je travaille avec l'organisation Congo Basin Conservation Society, basée en RDC, au sein de la société civile environnementale congolaise. La question de marché carbone chez nous a été perçue comme un marché volontaire, et aujourd'hui, il y a des critiques au niveau global où on dit que le marché carbone aujourd'hui est considéré comme une fausse solution parce que on a tenté les projets RED, rien n'a abouti. Est-ce que pensez-vous qu'il y a possibilité d'avoir avez-vous de nouvelles stratégies qui vont faire à ce que peut-être qui viennent donner des réponses au-delà du processus RED qui existe, qui n'est pas perceptible sur le terrain de manière concrète. Et du coup, de deux, on voudrait avoir la position de Climate Change par rapport à la géo-ingénierie. Et aujourd'hui, on parle de la géo-ingénierie. Nous, notre position comme société civile environnementale en RDC, aussi dans une coalition africaine, nous sommes contre la géo-ingénierie, nous sommes contre les énergies fossiles pour essayer de maintenir l'équilibre planétaire. Quelle serait votre position face à ça? Merci beaucoup.
Merci infiniment, et je vais répondre à vos deux questions. Une question donc plutôt, un ensemble de questions sur la compensation, les marchés carbone, et un autre plutôt sur la géo-ingénierie, puis aussi les technologies de capture. Il y a un objectif aujourd'hui qui est celui de l'accroissement des puits de carbone. Accroître la capacité naturelle de la planète à absorber du CO2 via ses forêts et ses océans. La première étape, c'est de conserver nos capacités d'absorption actuelles, donc de faire de la conservation des forêts tropicales notamment, mais également des tourbières, des marécages, etc. Donc ça, c'est la mission notamment que se donne RED+, effectivement, avec plus ou moins de succès. Un deuxième enjeu, c'est celui d'accroître le volume de ces puits de carbone dans des proportions qui restent raisonnables et compatibles avec les modes de vie. Donc l'idée à ce moment-là, c'est de commencer à investir dans des projets de captation naturelle. C'est le cas de la forestation ou de la plantation d'arbres, mais ça peut être le cas effectivement aussi de la captation directe du CO2 dans l'atmosphère, qui est évoquée par le GIEC. Ça peut être par des systèmes aussi de capture et de stockage du CO2 en sortie de cheminées industrielles, par exemple. Ce sont aujourd'hui, on l'a beaucoup étudié dans le rapport 2021, le bilan sectoriel 2021, on a fait toute une étude là-dessus. Ce sont des technologies qui aujourd'hui font l'objet d'un sursaut d'investissement de la part notamment des compagnies pétrolières puisque la capture du CO2 en sortie de cheminée industrielle est essentiellement utilisée pour redonner vie, si j'ose dire, à des puits de pétrole en faisant remonter un peu la pression. Bref, je ne vous passe les détails techniques, mais aujourd'hui, c'est essentiellement le secteur pétrolier qui investit dans la capture du CO2, qui donc du coup n'est pas stocké. Il est réinjecté pour des processus de relance de la production pétrolière. Donc, ces manières artificielles de capter le carbone, elles sont prometteuses, elles sont indispensables, même si on en croit les scénarios du GIEC, mais il faut les développer en bonne intelligence et surtout mettre des investissements suffisants pour pouvoir les développer à échelle industrielle, parce qu'aujourd'hui, c'est complètement anecdotique à l'échelle de la planète. Pour ce qui est de la géo-ingénierie, bon, climate change, de manière générale, ne prend pas position pour ou contre un type de solution. Aujourd'hui, c'est quelque chose qui reste de l'ordre de l'hypothèse. Et donc, on ne s'y intéresse pas beaucoup. Simplement, ce qu'on observe, c'est notre mission aussi, c'est de démontrer qu'il y a sur le terrain aujourd'hui un champ d'action, un répertoire d'action déjà prometteur et qui fait ses preuves. Vous pourrez le voir à travers tous les cas d'études qu'on a mis en ligne également, sans aller développer de la géo-ingénierie par ailleurs, qui reste extrêmement hypothétique, mais tout comme des technologies comme l'hydrogène, qui nous paraissent plus proches de nous aujourd'hui, mais qui sont aujourd'hui encore très peu développées et surtout très carbonées. Donc les marchés carbone, tout simple, pour revenir là-dessus, on est voilà, sur une tendance à l'accélération des transactions. Il y a beaucoup d'intérêt de la part des entreprises dans le cadre de leur stratégie de compensation et de neutralité carbone. Le premier enjeu et l'enjeu le plus fondamental, ce sont les méthodologies sur lesquelles on se base pour évaluer les scénarios contrefactuels, c'est-à-dire quel aurait été le niveau de déforestation si on n'avait pas mis en place un projet carbone. Aujourd'hui, on sait que ces méthodologies sont contestées. Il y a un vrai débat public là-dessus. Il y a un enjeu aussi d'affichage environnemental pour les entreprises, de communication. Et il faut que le législateur, et c'est ce que la Commission européenne essaie de faire, engage aussi les entreprises à privilégier des voies de décarbonation. Donc réduire leurs émissions propres liées à leurs activités économiques avant, ou en priorité, disons, par rapport aux stratégies de compensation et d'achat des crédits. C'est très frustrant, on ne va pas pouvoir en parler plus que ça parce qu'on a déjà dépassé le temps et je merci d'être restés si nombreux pour discuter. Simplement vous dire qu'il y a un dossier spécial sur donc, la compensation carbone au sein du rapport. On pourra refaire un webinaire spécifique sur le sujet parce qu'on sait que ça attire énormément, il y a beaucoup de questions et en plus on est en contact avec plein d'experts là-dessus, donc ça peut être vraiment une bonne occasion de se retrouver à nouveau. Merci beaucoup de nous avoir suivis aujourd'hui, d'être si nombreux à venir dans nos webinaires chaque mois et chaque semaine. On vous donne rendez-vous, on vous l'a dit, donc le 23 mars pour l'IMAG sur l'agroécologie, les systèmes alimentaires et la forêt, dans lequel on pourra peut-être reparler des marchés carbone également. Je vous souhaite une excellente journée, un bon appétit et à très bientôt. Merci.
Merci, mais à vous.
Merci à tous, à bientôt.
Merci.
Merci, au revoir.